And my goodness gracious, have we not given them enough?
For what purpose, gentleman from Washington?
I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5
I yield
minutes.
myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
In deference to my good friend from Florida, I really believe that this is a political amendment that would simply require companies seeking to drill offshore to estimate the impact that the oil and gas increased oil and gas production would have on gasoline prices. Mr. Chairman, let me repeat again. This bill is about increasing American domestic energy production. It's about reducing our dependence on foreign oil. It's about creating American jobs and creating American energy. Simply put, requiring producers to estimate the impact that each and every well has on global markets is nothing more than bureaucratic paperwork nightmare that would be put on those that would want to go and drill offshore, and delaying tactic by those that are opposed to offshore development. I don't think this is a good amendment, and as I said in deference to my good friend from Florida, I really believe that this is a political amendment, and I urge rejection of the amendment, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House, and any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings or other audible conversation is in violation of the House rules. Chair.
Mr. Speaker, do I have any time remaining?
Gentleman has 30 seconds.
I am going to use my 30 seconds. I had hoped to be able to yield to my good friend for a question, and perhaps I can get it in. Do you dispute, Representative Hastings, that we now have 55 million acres under lease, 70% of it is not being utilized, and in the final analysis, that if all of what we wanted to drill, that it would amount to more than 2% of the world's output?
If the gentleman will yield,
I will
and
yield.
if you run out of time, I will claim the time and we'll discuss. First, I do not deny that, except the figures that you're using aren't quite accurate. And I will say that in the sense that the 2% you're talking about is known reserves.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
The 2% that the figure that you're using is the known reserves. The potential resources that we have are much, much greater than that. And really, when you're looking at potential future energy production in this country, is you look at the potential resources, not the known reserves. There's a big, big difference. And the 2% is reserved. So I will acknowledge that while we have 2% right now, our potential resources are much, much larger. And I'll yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman, but in the Gulf of Mexico, which holds the largest volume of undiscovered or technically recoverable resources, 32 million acres are under lease. However, only approximately 10 million acres have approved exploration or development plans, and only 6.4 million of these acres are in production. Leased areas in the Gulf of Mexico that are not producing or not subject to pending or approved exploration and development plans are estimated to contain 17.9 billion barrels of UTRR oil and 49.7 trillion cubic feet. And so I make the argument again to my dear friend that if we're talking about doing everything that you call for, and I know it's most sincerely, if we do that, we're not talking about reducing the price of gas, but by a nickel. So where is
reclaiming my time.
Show me the plan to get us to energy independence by drilling.
Reclaiming my time, but the gentleman is talking about. What the gentleman is talking about in lease sales, somebody has made an investment. They do not know if that area has any oil or natural gas. They don't know. They'll go through all those studies. They'll spend millions and sometimes billions of dollars finding out if there's something there. Then, if they think there is, they'll drill costing that much more. Now, I might add, these lease sales are there is a set time. the federal government gets money from these lease sales. Why would somebody give the money to the federal government if they didn't think there was something there? And by the way, many times these leases come up empty and the company walks away and the only revenue goes to the federal government. But let me speak, to the amendment, one other area, because what the gentleman is really saying with this amendment is he is asking somebody that produces a crude product to estimate the price of a finished product. That's like telling an apple grower in my part of the country that if he or she should sell apples overseas, what's the price of applesauce going to be down the line? Now, it doesn't make any sense to do that. Now, whether the gentleman purposely did that or not, I don't know. But in any case, I don't believe that the amendment ought to be adopted for other reasons, but certainly for that one. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge a no vote on the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in Part C of House Report 112-616. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in Part C of House Report Number 112-616, offered by Mr. Hastings of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 738, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do want to say in the last exchange that I had with my good friend that I deeply appreciate his yielding some of his time to me, and I'm glad that he didn't compare apples to oranges. I thought that's what he was going to do, but he went down the applesauce route. Mr. Chairman, my Republican colleagues continue, in my opinion, to cling to an antiquated 19th century energy policy, while the rest of the world has moved into the 21st century. Just because the majority members of Congress refuse to acknowledge that human activity contributes to climate change does not make it true. Climate change is not an abstract or difficult scientific principle to grasp. The effects are all around us. Our country is currently experiencing its worst drought since the Dust Bowl in the year of my birth, 1936. Just last week, sudden violent storms rocked the East Coast. They were referred to as microbursts, knocking out power for thousands and killing a number of people. Furthermore, record heat waves are having serious repercussions in crop yields. We must pursue responsible, sustainable energy policies, both for the legacy that we will leave our children and also to make certain the United States is at the forefront of an emerging green economy. My amendment will not let oil companies shield themselves in ignorance any longer. It requires each permit application an analysis and estimate of the impact on global climate change of the consumption of the fossil fuels discovered. While the oil and gas found under each individual lease may not have a huge impact, there is no question that the aggregate fossil fuel consumption contributes to global climate change. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment in order to force my friends that are House Republicans and big oil companies to acknowledge the reality that the international community is preparing for. Interestingly, Mr. Chairman, when I was president of the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, its headquarters is in Denmark. And I went to Denmark during the 2-year period of time, close to 30 times over the course of the years that I've been here. And when I fly into Denmark, just coming from the side of Sweden, I see the windmills tilting that have been tilting for 16 years. And Denmark's city, Copenhagen, is the beneficiary of much of that production. They're headed toward the future. We're living in the past. I reserve the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
In many respects, Mr. Chairman, we just had this debate. And again, deference to my good friend from Florida, I think this is another political amendment because what it would do is require companies seeking to drill offshore to estimate the potential impact produced by oil and gas, natural gas production, what impact that would have on climate change. Not only that, you would have to do it on a well-by-well basis. Now, Mr. Chairman, in all honesty, some sort of requirement like that would simply dry up anybody wanting to drill offshore or utilize our resources offshore. Now, if that's what the gentleman wants, then okay, that's a good concession. But if not, it simply does not make any sense. But from a practical standpoint, and I think this is very important, Mr. Chairman, if the issue, and there is some debate about this, no question, but if the issue of producing oil and natural gas will affect the climate, and we as a country probably have the most stringent laws, environmental laws, on our air quality and water quality, why would we put this extra burden on us when it wouldn't happen in other parts of the world, but the net effect of this, if it were to become law, is to drive everybody from America. So the net effect, if the issue is really to protect the environment and protect the air, why would you drive it to areas that have less stringent environmental laws? Yet that would be the practical effect if this amendment were to become law. Like I said, we've been over this before. It puts extraordinary burdens on individual wells and individual producers. And as I mentioned, in deference to my friend, I think it is a political amendment. I urge rejection, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized. He has 1 minute and 45 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in the words of the celebrated movie that these words came from, I'm shocked, just shocked that this is a political amendment. And I'm equally shocked that this bill is political. This is the 143rd time that we are talking about oil drilling, and somewhere along the line, I'm lost. I thought politics was what we do. That's what I do. That's what people sent me here to do. That's what you do, my good friend, is politics. That's what it's about. The difference is, where we separate ourselves is whether we're talking about the politics of the future, where there are opportunities for us to do the things to bring us to energy independence, or whether or not we're going to cling to fossil fuels until we just can't find any place else to drill. My major opposition to oil drilling offshore has been demonstrably shown when the Deep Horizon accident occurred. There have been other accidents. You want to drill in the tundra. There have been accidents where oil was spilled in that area. And daily in Fort Lauderdale, I see ships that are sitting off of the shore, and I find that occasionally those tar things that come from them wind up on those beaches. We make $60 billion a year in Florida on those resources. I heard you earlier, my colleague, argue about North Dakota. I don't want to be in North Dakota in the wintertime, and I'm glad if they're about their business doing what they want to do, but I know a lot of North Dakota people, when they finish with the drilling up there, are going to come to Florida to our beaches, and that's what I'm about trying to preserve. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Well, I too am shocked, but I'm glad we got that out of the way. Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, this bill is a bill that addresses American energy and American jobs, and therefore has a positive effect, potential positive effect on our economy. This amendment adds nothing to that. As a matter of fact, I think it's an impediment to this bill becoming law if it were to be adopted. And if I could think of some sort of things to say regarding oranges, I would say it, but I'm totally at loss. So I would simply say that this amendment does not deserve support. I urge its rejection, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise.
Question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee on the Whole House and the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 6082, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 6082 and has come to no resolution thereon. The Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. Okay. The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leaves of absence requested for Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas between 1 and 5 p.m. today, and Mr. Reyes of Texas for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've had an extensive debate today on the floor centered around American energy and American jobs. And it is interesting in how this discussion has unfolded over time. Many times we on this side of the aisle are accused of repeating over and over and over different issues. And I suppose to a certain extent that is true. But one of the reasons why this effort is done on a regular basis is because the genius of our founding fathers was such that they created a government where there was a division of powers. And we all know that, the three branches of government. But the genius of our founding fathers was even greater than that in the fact that they gave the legislative branch and they divided that power. They divided that power between the House and the Senate. And what that simply means, Mr. Speaker, is that before any legislation can pass, any law that's put on anybody in this country has to pass both houses of the Congress. Now, I recognize I'm a member of the People's House. There has been no member of this House in the history of our country that was not elected to this House. On the other hand, the Senate is a different body, as we well know. The Senate is made up of only 2 members from each of the states, regardless of population. And so, because we come from different constituencies, one a smaller constituency within a state, another from a whole state like the Senate is, you're bound to have different ideas as you approach legislation. But again, the genius of our founding fathers was to say that, okay, before anything can become law, both houses have to act on that legislation, and it has to pass both the House and the Senate without a comma being difference. And therein, of course, lies the challenge. So we've been accused here many times of passing the same type of legislation, at least on the same issue, and passing it over to the other body. What we have found, unfortunately, in this Congress is that the other body has simply not acted on a lot of pieces of legislation. Now, I'm not saying they should pick up, although it'd be nice if they took everything that we pass and say it's a wonderful idea and pass it over there and send it to the President. Well, they don't do that. But one of the functions that they could do, and they haven't done, is pass legislation, albeit be different than what we have, and then, of course, we have a mechanism to work out the difference. But in many respects, Mr. Speaker, not even that has happened. In other words, they haven't passed legislation where they may have a disagreement with us that we can work out the differences. So that leads to a lot of frustration, obviously, on our side of the rotunda, but we feel it's important, as a Republican majority, to continue to make the case in what we believe in. And I might mention also that the House is controlled by majority by the Republicans, and of course the Democrats control the Senate. So there's a difference. So that's why we continue to send legislation over to the Senate. And we hold out hope that maybe one time they'll take up legislation, maybe on the same issue, and we can go to conference and work out whatever differences. So that's why we continue to bring this legislation to the floor. I look forward to a time when the Senate will in fact act. Now let me talk then about this piece of legislation that we had on the floor today and why it was brought to the floor and how the process is going to unfold tomorrow. As I mentioned in my opening remarks on debate, the President, any President by the way, is required to submit a 5-year energy plan on the Outer Continental Shelf, or the OCS, and submit it for a 60-day review for Congress. That clock started ticking in June last. So we felt it was important because I, for one, and a number of my colleagues on the House Natural Resources Committee, in fact throughout this Congress, felt that the President's plan was inadequate and that there ought to be an alternative to that plan. Thus, we had a markup several weeks ago on the plan that we had before us today. We're debating it tonight now. We've gone through the debate. We've had the amendment process. And we will we'll vote on this bill tomorrow. But what is missing in all of this equation was simply that there was no effort to defend the President's plan. As a matter of fact, in the debate that I had heard from the other side, rarely did I hear anybody saying that the President's energy plan was a good plan. So tomorrow there will be on suspension legislation that I reluctantly offered that is essentially the President's energy plan. And so we'll have a vote. So tomorrow the House will have an opportunity to say yes to this job-creating bill that we had on the floor today, or the President's plan. There will be a distinct choice that members of this body will have an opportunity to vote on. I certainly hope that they'll support the job-creating, the America energy-creating plan that we debated today, and I hope that they will reject President Obama's plan. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, is recognized for 55 minutes as a designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. An issue tonight that is much more important to the American people than many realize is Medicaid. Now, for folks who don't understand this, and that's and you really have no need to unless until this health care debate began, but if you will, there's three types of coverage for folks who have insurance. One is Medicare, and Medicare is the program for folks who are typically 65 and above. It is the program that all of us pay into, having a certain amount deducted from our paycheck, and it goes into this account. The second is private insurance. 90% of Americans have their private insurance policy through their employer. And then the last group is Medicaid. Now, Medicaid is a program designed to support those of lower income, as well as those who are elderly and, again, of lower income in long-term care, think nursing homes. And lastly, it supports the blind and disabled. The financing of Medicaid comes from your tax dollars, but it can be your tax dollars either funneled through the federal government, paying a portion to the state, which is matched by what is called the state match, which is from the state itself. So Medicaid is a program for lower income, which receives about, on average, 57% of the money that goes towards it from the federal government and 43% on average from the state government. And the state administers the program to take care of, again, low income for acute medical services, long-term care, think nursing homes for the elderly, and then the blind and disabled. And tonight's discussion will be about Medicaid. Now, the importance of Medicaid is that 16% of the health care dollar in the United States goes towards Medicaid. So almost a little bit over 1/8 of the money our country spends is on this combined federal-state program that provides health insurance, if you will, for the poor. Additionally, Medicaid is important because right now, Medicaid is consuming an ever larger portion of both the federal government's budget as well as the state government's budget. One example of this, the Simpson-Bowles Bipartisan Debt Commission, which President Obama appointed to help give guidance as to how our country could get out of our indebtedness, pinpointed Medicaid as one of the drivers of our national debt. So, first we know that on a national level, Medicaid has been pinpointed as a driver of our national debt. On a state level, Medicaid is consuming an ever larger portion of state budgets. Now, there's many examples of the importance of this, but as Medicaid is costing more and more, state dollars for other programs are less and less. Senator Lamar Alexander from Tennessee said that the reason that tuition is increasing at universities in Tennessee is because there's less public support. More tax dollars are going to Medicaid, and so therefore to make up the budget for the universities in Tennessee, they have to increase tuition. One example of this as well for K through 12 is that for the first time beginning around 2009, states spent more of their income upon Medicaid than on education. And so this is a chart from the National Association of State Budget Officers, and it shows how total state spending on Medicaid now surpasses K-12 education, and K-12 is kindergarten to 12th grade. So this is primary and secondary education. And in this blue line, you see funding for education, and you can see the percent of total state expenditures devoted to in this case education. And so in 2008, it peaked at around 22%, and now in 2011, it has decreased down to roughly 22%. I'm sorry, it started off as roughly 22% here, and now it is down to roughly 20%. Here you can see that in 2008, Medicaid expenditures were about 20.7% of the state budget, and it is rapidly rising. It is now up to almost 24%. We are now spending more money providing Medicaid services for those who are eligible than we are educating our children. Now, it isn't as if this is something that is temporary related to the recession. This is actually expected to continue to worsen. So Medicaid, again, the program that both the federal and state governments, which means both taxpayers paying to the state and taxpayers paying to the federal government finance, is growing so rapidly that it is cannibalizing the rest of the state budget. An example of this is that expenditures for primary and secondary education now, for the first time in history, are lower than those expenditures for Medicaid, and this is expected to worsen. So, if you will, we have this program, which is important. It's a safety net program, but under its current construction, it's costing more and more. Now, I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues, and I will first go to Dr. Nan Hayworth, who is an ophthalmologist. She held up a note earlier, but she didn't realize that my eyes are not good enough to read the note. But an ophthalmologist from New York, and she can discuss how the President Obama's health care plan expands Medicaid, a program which is rapidly expanding in cost, nonetheless will be further expanded in terms of those who benefit. Yeah.
And I thank our colleague, Dr. Cassidy, and I understand that your time may be slightly limited this evening, Doctor. So Dr. Harris and I will be more than happy to lead this discussion as we go along. And I thank you for all the work you do on this very important subject. Well, the American public has much to be concerned about with regard to the massive 2010 health law. And this was, of course, passed on a party line basis, unfortunately. I and Dr. Harris are two of the representatives who were elected in part in response to the public's grave concerns about this act. And if I can direct everyone's attention to the chart that Dr. Cassidy has revealed next to him, you can see what is projected to happen in terms of Medicaid spending alone as the years go by. And of course, under the terms of the Affordable Care Act, it's like putting gasoline on a fire, unfortunately, in terms of the burdens.
The gentlelady will yield.
Yes, absolutely.
If you will, federal and state Medicaid spending in billions of 2010 dollars. Currently, by 2009, it's down here the years, so 1993, 2009, going out to 2081. And so here is about $400 billion. This is combined federal and state spending. By 2017, this rises to $750 billion. By 2025, obviously within our lifetime, it'll rise to close to $1 trillion. And projections are by 2081, it'll be over $4.5 trillion.
And I'm going to imagine, Dr. Cassidy, that this chart does not take into account, because it could be indeed very difficult to do so, but it has to enter the public mind when we think about these things. The enormous cost on the American public of the well-intentioned but poorly designed 2010 health law will make our economy weaker. So it's fair to anticipate that there will be a further impetus to acceleration of Medicaid spending merely because of the imposition of that $2 trillion or more of Washington-generated cost due to the terms of the Affordable Care Act. So this is an issue that concerns every one of us, not only people who are truly in need and unable to sustain a job or their health care. And, you know, we've all met these fellow citizens, and I have in my own district, the Hudson Valley of New York. These are people like the folks I met at Park, which is a center that provides for people who are severely disabled by developmental disabilities such as autism, but not only autism. And these are good people who, no matter how robust the economy is, will not be able to afford the kind of care that they need. And those are the people, in particular, whom Medicaid was initially intended to help.
So the gentlelady will yield.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
So just to emphasize, Medicaid is an important safety net program.
Right.
For those folks without means. It was traditionally designed to take care of the blind and disabled,
right,
the elderly and long-term care,
right,
and then oftentimes focused upon pregnant women and upon children. Mm-hmm. So the importance of making sure the program is sound is that we continue to care for these people. I yield back.
Not at all, sir, and thank you. Precisely. So we need to be able to provide for the people who are most in need. That is a reasonable role for government in a great nation. But what we don't want to do, what we want to avoid, is creating economic hardship that will push more Americans into this category, and we see that phenomenon happening across our economy as we speak. And it's one of the reasons why so many states have said we cannot possibly afford to expand our Medicaid programs because, indeed, Dr. Cassidy, you being the good teacher that you are, provided me with an example from the state of Connecticut with their recent experience in opening up their Medicaid program and opening up the enrollment, because they had such a dramatic increase. I think it was something like 70% increase in the number of enrollees that the state actually couldn't handle that increase in any way readily. So their services to all of their Medicaid recipients, unfortunately of necessity, were compromised.
So if the gentlelady will yield, I'd like to bring in Dr. Harris, who's an anesthesiologist from Maryland, Eastern Shore. And you just mentioned how Medicaid, as it attempts to expand and be all things to all people, becomes stressed. Mm-hmm. And in that stress becomes less capable of being anything to anybody.
Exactly.
And so the purpose, the concern regarding a program which becomes, again, too stretched, too unfocused, is that it becomes ineffective at its original mission. Dr. Harris, I can put up this, leave this one or go to the next?
You could, yeah, if the gentleman from Louisiana would just leave that one up, and just so that the American public who's watching just understand, because the picture says 1,000 words. That picture is the growth of Medicaid for the next generation. My son is 12 now. When he reaches age 65, he'll be at the right-hand side of that graph. And although none of us like to think of it, we all remember when we were 12. We never thought we'd retire. But here we are, nearing retirement age, so it's not that far off in the future. And if I read that graph correctly, our current entire budget in 2010 dollars is $3.5 trillion. Our entire budget, federal budget, paying for everything. That graph indicates by the time my child reaches retirement age, every penny of that budget would be taken up by Medicaid. Every penny. Not a single penny for Medicare, not a single penny left over for Social Security, not a single penny left over for interest on a debt that is now $16 trillion and growing, not a single penny left for defense, not a single penny left for Pell Grants, not a single penny left for anything.
So the gentleman will yield. I think the point being made is that not only will the safety net become tattered in of itself, but rather, even though tattered, it will destroy all these other important governmental functions, our ability to finance these other governmental functions. I yield back.
The gentleman is correct. Every single program that we have, whether it's to help the elderly with health care, the elderly with Social Security, whether it's food stamps, whether it's unemployment insurance, whether it's to do the things this government has to do, like pay the interest on an ever-growing debt, whether it's Pell Grants, whether it's K-12 education, which your last slide showed. Every single program that we have is threatened by this one single program, a program that the President's Affordable Care Act ballooned out of control.
Now, when you say, if I may reclaim my time, if you could elaborate, we know that under the President's health care proposal, that Medicaid, a program which right now is driving federal indebtedness and which is threatening to bankrupt states, was greatly expanded, despite that, was greatly expanded under the President's health care proposal to include people up to 133% of federal poverty level. So I'll yield back to the gentleman if he'll just comment, if this is what he's referring to regarding expansion, if so, any further thoughts he has.
The gentleman's absolutely right. What we've done is we've once again made promises to people we know we can't keep. We know because that graph, if the gentleman, I'll yield to the gentleman to answer the question, that's from the Congressional Budget Office. That's a nonpartisan group that objectively looks at the effect of federal laws and policies and projects the anticipated cost. Is that correct? I'll yield back.
That is correct.
If the gentleman would yield. So what we have here is we have a third party looking at what's going on and saying the emperor has no clothes. That in fact, if we continue the current policy with Medicaid, which, as the gentleman well knows, roughly doubles the number of people eligible for the safety net program under the Affordable Care Act, we will not only bankrupt the Medicaid program, future generations will no longer have the ability to be confident that Social Security will be there when they retire, Medicare will be there when we retire. The ratings agencies, whether it's Moody's, Standard & Poor's, all the various rating agencies will look at us and say, you don't have the ability to pay the interest back on your debt. We know when that bill was passed, we know what happened, we know the Cornhusker kickback, we know what went on, the buying and selling of votes at the expense of future generations and the ability of the federal government to keep their promises to future generations, the promises of Medicare, Medicaid, again, Pell Grants, K-12 education. The gentleman showed a slide that showed a 3% increase in the cost, an average of 3% in the state's budget, the cost of Medicaid over the past only 3 years before the President's health care bill kicks in. Well, as the President may know, in Maryland, that's a $1 billion, 3% doesn't sound like much, but in Maryland, that's a $1 billion increase. That's an increase we can't afford. That's an increase that means that property or income taxes would have to go up, further strangling our economy. And as the gentleman full recognizes, this is why the President's policy with regards to Medicare and the Affordable Care Act is poorly thought out, is going to bankrupt the nation, and really ought to be repealed and rethought.
Now, if the gentleman will yield, I'll go to Dr. Desjarlais, who joined us, who, although has a French last name and you would think he was from Louisiana, is actually from Tennessee. Now, Dr. Desjarlais, obviously to you and me, but perhaps not to those who are listening, Tennessee experimented with using Medicaid as a safety net program back in the 90s, and if you will, extended it to many others. Could you comment, if I can yield to you, please, could you please comment as to the results of that?
No, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and you're absolutely right. I moved to start my practice in Tennessee in the fall of '93, and our program TennCare was implemented somewhat as an experiment in '94, January '94. So I witnessed it from its inception through what I would call its continuous failure. The program continued to grow and expand, continued, as I think you referenced early, as substantiated by Senator Lamar Alexander, has drained our state's educational resources, and it got so bad that in 2007, Governor Bredesen actually had to remove about 270,000 people from the program just to keep the state from going bankrupt. So clearly it was an example of how the program and the system does not work, and did not work, and that's maybe a glimpse of what we can expect to see moving forward with the President's health care law. So it failed to accomplish its objectives, and just as we would have suspected, the cost grew exponentially. And so, you know, we have a great example in Tennessee of how the system does not work. So clearly we need alternative reforms, and be happy to yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Brown.
Well, thank you, Dr. Desjardins. I appreciate your yielding. In fact, Medicaid is going to destroy the federal budget and create a total economic collapse of America if we don't change it from the present system. That's before Obamacare even takes place and markedly expands the states having to cover many more people, as my good friend from Maryland, Dr. Harris, was just explaining. But there are alternatives. Hopefully we can repeal Obamacare and replace it with something that makes sense. But there's a solution today. And in fact, the Republican Study Committee, several of us in the Republican Study Committee, Jim Jordan, our chairman, Todd Rokita, Tim Holzkamp, and I introduced the State Health Flexibility Act, which would freeze Medicaid spending at the current level and will block grant those funds to the states with no strings attached, not only for Medicaid but also for the state child health insurance program. And what the states would do is utilize those funds in any manner that they want to. If they want to do drug testing on Medicaid or S-CHIP recipients, they can. They can organize the program any way they want to, which is going to be the solution because it freezes spending at current levels.
If the gentleman will yield.
Absolutely.
I'll say that I just out of pride of authorship, there's another alternative, a Republican Medicaid proposal, one that I and others are sponsoring, and it does, if you will, similar to the block grant, but it readjusts as your population changes. I'm from Louisiana. When Hurricane Katrina hit, we had lots of folks who moved to Atlanta and moved to Houston. If you will, the dollar would follow the patient. It wouldn't just stay in Louisiana. I love my state, and it would be nice to have the extra money, but it's more important that where the patient is have the money. It's a variation on the theme, but also part of it is that the state has flexibility, freeing them from the money-consuming regulations that the federal government puts on how those monies are applied. I yield back.
Absolutely. In fact, the State Health Flexibility Act does that same thing, and it does, the only growth is population, due to population growth in any state. So it does account for that change in the population of any given state. But we have solutions. We have economically viable solutions that Republicans are submitting, and hopefully we can get passed into law. But of course we've got to have a Senate that will even take up those kind of bills, because the House has passed bill after bill after bill to create a stronger economy, to create jobs here in America, to lower the cost of gasoline, to develop all our energy resources. We've got these bills that will solve the problems for Medicaid. Even my Patient Option Act is across-the-board health care reform. It repeals Obamacare and replaces it with policy that makes health care cheaper for everyone, provides coverage for all Americans, and will save Medicare from going broke. And when you add that with the State Health Flexibility Act, it covers everybody. We have solutions. But Harry Reid is the obstructionist. He's acting as a puppet for this president, and they throw in the trash can every bill we send over there. We've got to create jobs. We've got to create a stronger economy. We have solutions to the health care problem. All of us are physicians. All of us are physicians out here that are talking tonight. We've just been joined by one non-physician, but she's been a strong supporter of the Doctors Caucus, and we've seen her here many times, Ms. Lummis from Wyoming. But we have solutions. The American people need to understand Republicans have solutions. And we need to have the ability to pass those solutions into law so that we can have policy that's not going to break the bank. We're going to an economic collapse of America if we don't stop this inanity.
One thing I'm struck, if the gentleman will yield, one thing I am struck, and I'd like to bring Ms. Lummis in, is that oftentimes it is when folks say, well, wait a second, it's Medicaid and the government will pay for it, or the state should enroll because the federal government is going to pay so much more. And there's a sense that it is the government that is paying for it, but not the taxpayer. Now, what we know is the government is nothing but an aggregator of our pocketbooks.
That's right.
And it will take that money and bequeath it. I asked Ms. Loomis to come tonight because she is a former state treasurer in Wyoming. And
before you go to Ms. Loomis, I'd like to reclaim my time and just say this. Our state of Georgia is struggling. We have a balanced budget amendment to our state constitution. We're having a difficult time dealing with the extra cost, not only of Medicaid, but all these government mandates that is forced it upon our state from the federal government. It has to stop, and the only way we'll stop it is for we the people across this country to demand a different kind of governance from their senators and congressmen, and particularly from the President of the United States. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Mr. Chair, I'd like to recognize Ms. Loomis to discuss the impact this program is having upon state budgets and therefore other state services, but I would need to yield to you so that you can then recognize Dr. Harris to replace me at this stand.
And I thank the gentleman for inviting me to participate. Although a non-physician, the only non-physician here.
Will the gentlelady suspend?
I will.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from New Jersey,
Maryland,
Mr. Harris, is recognized for 28 minutes as the designee of the majority party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will yield to the gentlelady from Wyoming.
I thank Dr. Harris, and I want to thank Dr. Cassidy. I have seen Dr. Cassidy in the cloakroom talking on the phone pro bono to patients that he used to serve in Louisiana. And I have seen other members of our Doctors Caucus do the same thing. These are people who care about their patients. And even though they're here working for the people of the United States and their district and not compensated financially, they are still here caring about their patients, working without compensation, pro bono, to help people that they used to serve to make sure their lives are better and their health care is better. So I want to compliment the physicians in this conference that have made such a difference to my life and to other people's health care lives, and I want to thank them for serving in Congress. They make a huge difference in the dialogue, the debate, the nurturing, the care, the tenderness, and what we all experience because of their training and because of their love of the people of this country and the manner in which they serve their patients. Mr. Speaker, I was state treasurer of my state. I have seen Medicaid and other programs soak up the compensation that taxpayers in every state provide through taxes to their states, preventing states from being able to allocate more money to education and other state-based functions. And Medicaid is definitely one of them. But in addition, states care for their working poor. States want to see their low-income Medicaid-eligible people have access to high-quality health care and support the Medicaid program, but not support it in a way that requires these rigid handcuffs on states in a one-size-fits-all program that prevents states from innovating, from providing quality care to their people. Case in point, my state of Wyoming has the smallest population in the nation. As a consequence, we have the opportunity to study things that other states cannot study because their populations are so large. My state of Wyoming, through its own health care commission, studied every single Medicaid-eligible child under the age of 18 and determined that it would be over 2.5 times cheaper to buy each one of those children a standard Blue Cross Blue Shield policy than it is to provide health care through Medicaid. These are the kind of things that states are studying, that they're learning, that they're innovating. Furthermore, there are places in the country that are dealing with different health care problems than other places in the country. Case in point, the Rocky Mountain West has a much higher incidence of multiple sclerosis than other parts of the United States. No one knows why, but it's a fact. So Wyoming and other Rocky Mountain states should be able to concentrate on MS, whereas other states, perhaps southern states, may have more problems with diabetes. I recently was in Saudi Arabia. There's a tremendous diabetes problem in Saudi Arabia. They're spending tremendous amounts of money at their brand new higher education university where they partner with businesses to study diabetes in a way that will help the great number and growing number of people that are affected by diabetes. These should be things that regions of our country are allowed to work together on and to create programs for and to innovate and to be the great incubators of innovation that states are. And so that's why I do want to compliment the U.S. Supreme Court in the portion of the decision on Obamacare that provided that states do not have to be held hostage under the Obamacare law. They do not have to expand beyond the original intent of the Medicaid-eligible population to accommodate its expansion under the Obamacare law, when they can still, if they choose, concentrate on the Medicaid-eligible population as it exists today to continue to provide quality Medicaid to low-income eligible constituents within their states. But that doesn't mean they should be under the same constraints they are under now to provide Medicaid to their populations because of the variance in the kind of diseases that are cropping up in different parts of the country, and because of the different innovations that states are able to use if they're not constrained by the shackles of federal one-size-fits-all. And I want to thank the physicians in our conference for continuing to raise these issues, to discuss these issues. You discuss them to the benefit of those of us who are not physicians who serve with you in Congress. You discuss these issues to the benefits of the people to whom you provide health care in this nation, and you do it as a service to the people of this country. I thank all of the physicians who are here tonight to discuss this issue, and I yield back.
And thank you very much to the gentlelady from Wyoming for bringing up that point about what Medicaid does to state governments and what the potential is to state governments and all the other programs that they have to fund. I will tell you that with regards to what happens is that what we know is that the access under the Medicaid program is already suffering, the access of patients. Again, you know, passing the Affordable Care Act puts a insurance card, a Medicaid card, in the hands of probably 10 to 12 million Americans, but that doesn't guarantee access to health care. As we know, and as a physician, I've taken care of Medicaid patients for almost 30 years, but increasingly what I'm finding is that my colleagues, facing the decreased payment reimbursements by the governments who are under financial hardship now. Well, there are very few states in the Union that actually have extra money around to fund that Medicaid increase, and even under the current conditions, as this chart will show. This chart shows various specialties and how Medicaid patients have access to them under current reimbursement, which of course will get nothing but worse for specialists under the new Affordable Care Act. Among all specialists, 89% of patients with private insurance have access to all specialists, only 34% of medical assistance patients or Medicaid patients, and that's true whether it's orthopedic, psychiatry, asthma, neurology, endocrinology, ear, nose, and throat, or dermatology, in all cases, the access to a physician is restricted because when a government controls a health care budget, the way it contains costs is by decreasing reimbursement to providers. That's the facts. That's what happens. That's what's going to happen under Medicaid. We know with the Independent Payment Advisory, but that's what's going to happen under Medicare. And I'll yield to the gentleman, the physician from Tennessee.
And I just thank you for yielding. And I'd just like to expound a little on what you had just commented on, and actually what the gentlelady from Wyoming talked about in terms of the efficiency in her study, where they could actually buy a policy for those cheaper than what the federal government has implemented. You know, we were promised better access to care at a lower cost with the Affordable Care Act, and the TennCare program in Tennessee really was an experiment of nationalized health care.